Hello, bonsoir, and welcome to the Get French Football News Show. I'm Nathan Staples, and joining me this evening are Rich Allen, Jeremy Smith, and Adam White. It's the final show of the season as the league and campaign has wound down ahead of looking forward to a summer transfer window, and the national team try their hardest to qualify for the European Championships. But who is looking to be champions next year, and who's going cold turkey? All of this and more after the latest headlines. The French women's side got their World Cup campaign off to a blockbuster start as they defeated South Korea 4-0 in the opening match of the tournament. A double from Wendy Renard in between strikes from Eugénie Le Sommer and the player of the game Amandine Henry gave Les Bleus the victory. The male side of the equation follow up their friendly win over Bolivia last weekend with a disappointing 2-0 loss to Turkey in Konya. First half strikes from Kaan Ayhan and Cengiz Under means the rising side under Şenol Güneş remain undefeated and force Les Bleus into second place in the group. In managerial news, Ghislain Priton has been named the new manager of Saint-Etienne. The former Bastille coach has been assistant under Jean-Louis Gasset and had the backing of plenty of the playing staff to take the reins. In transfer news, Paris Saint-Germain have confirmed that goalkeeper Gianluigi Buffon will be leaving this summer after deciding not to renew his contract. And it seems that Didier Deschamps has let the cat out of the bag that Ferland Mendy will be joining Real Madrid later on this summer. And that's all for now. But to keep up to date with all the news in the world of French football, head on over to our website at www.getfootballnewsfrance.com and follow us on Twitter at GFFN. We start this week with the positive for the Les Bleus teams, and that's the women's team who managed a 4-0 win, one of the biggest victories in women's opening match World Cup football. And it's nice for a home World Cup, Jez, for them to get off to a strong start, given that they are one of the favourites for the tournament for the first time and that they've invested well. They've got players that are in big Champions League teams now as well. This feels like a year for them, at least, more than any, that they can get a victory and come back with a trophy. And they got off to the best start they could have possibly done too.
Yeah, I mean, France have got to be seen as one of the favourites at the moment. They've got a really strong team. They've had a strong team or a strong squad for a while now, but in the last few major tournaments, they've just been found lacking, probably mainly in attack. They've often generally they've gone out in a match where they've dominated their opponent and just not been able to find the back of the net and just come up short with conceding one goal or on penalties. But this time the attack looks better as well. They've obviously got that core of 7 Lyon players who've just come off their 4th straight Champions League. So, and Diac, I think, has really sort of revitalised the team. You look at some of their sort of set piece plays, and clearly she's really innovating with them. She's got good choices. Valérie Gauvin has been playing up front for most of the last couple of years. She turned up late for training a couple of times this week, and so she was dropped. But I think that says a lot, partly for the way that Diac is running the team, which is good, but also for the fact that they now have a little bit of strength in depth. They can afford to drop their main centre forwards for the first match. And you look at France's records starting tournaments in the past. I think even in '84 they had a slow start. In '98 they were shaky against South Africa. This is the men's team, obviously. They were shaky against South Africa, and it took a goal off Dugarry's shoulder to calm the nerves. Even looking at the rugby in 2007, France started terribly against Argentina. So it's sort of in the national character not to start well and to start quite nervily. So for France to have such a dominant first game, and particularly a dominant start, they were rampant. Certainly the first quarter, basically the whole of the first half. I think the second half they took their foot off the gas a little bit. Hopefully bodes well. I mean, the other way that you can look at it is obviously 84, 88 or 98. Last year in 2018 in Russia, the men's team started a little bit slower and then kind of revved it up. So maybe you could say you don't want to sort of start too strong. You want to build it up and peak. But certainly no complaints with a 4-0 win against a South Korea side that were meant to be dark horses, but France made look very average. And yeah, going all the way through the team, there were some great performances. As you said, Amandine Henry is just, I think, an absolutely superb player, and frankly, she'd have done a better job than either Pogba or Sissoko on Saturday night. Really, she's also exactly the kind of player that Juninho is looking for Lyon's men's team at the moment. She sets the tone and scored the goal of the game. But you've got former captain Renard coming up with a couple of goals, and Bock unlucky not to score or to have a goal given with a cracking volley. Just the whole team looked good, looked in form. What was great was that they all looked, with celebrating the goals of the substitutes. They looked to be great spirit in the team as well. They certainly got the country behind them. I think they had viewing figures of 10 million, and then when they went down to Nice for the next match, which is on Wednesday, there were 500 odd people coming to see them in training. So I think certainly the feeling is good in the squad, around the squad, outside the squad, and hopefully they can keep that up all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, that I think Henry would have been a player that PSG would have even liked to look at, probably better than 90% of their centre midfielders last night with their performance at the weekend. And Rich, they are pretty strong favourites. There's been some good performances from some other teams, but they really dispatched South Korea last night. They've got Wendy Renard, was absolutely terrific, towering in defence. We all are aware of how good Le Sommer can be on a day, even though she grabbed a goal, but wasn't quite at the tip of her performance. But the factor will come in the later rounds, won't it? I mean, their group is other than South Korea, it seemed a little bit of a comfortable one to begin with, and they'll be pretty certain of finishing top. But once they reach those knockouts rounds, it's then much the proving ground and see if they can emulate the men.
Exactly, and I think two things that Jez touched upon there will be key. I think one is that strength in depth. Not too many teams in this tournament perhaps have the strength across the entire squad as France do, and that. I think the second point really is that unity within the squad. I think having such a huge presence of Lyon players, there's probably a risk that there could become a split in the camp of the Lyon team, the Lyon players, and then everybody else. But I think, as we saw, and as Jez rightly said it, with the celebrations and the way that they played together, is that yes, that starting 11 is Lyon based in the majority, but they play as a team, and we correlate that with back to the lead up to the last summer's World Cup for the men's team. What Deschamps was sort of preaching was the harmony in the squad, that everybody is together, that they are this single unit, and it seems as though that philosophy really has rubbed off and has been carried through by Corinne Diacre into this team, because you wouldn't have necessarily looked at that team and thought, you've got 7 Lyon players, they're only going to play for each other. There's going to be exclusions. There could be rifts. There's all that potential when you have, such a huge presence from one single team in a national team. But you couldn't tell. They played, I thought, in quite a Lyon-esque manner, really dominant. Didn't really let South Korea have a sniff of a chance. They were ruthless. 4 was probably going quite easy, I think, on South Korea. It could well have been even more than that. So it bodes really well. I think the next game will be a slightly trickier affair when they play Norway in a couple of days' time. That's probably going to be the toughest match, and will certainly be a bit more of a test for them, and test their credentials as to are they really going to be amongst the favourites, and can they carry on that dominant positive performance. So it's as good a start as you could possibly have hoped for France. So we just hope for more of the same on Wednesday.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm pretty certain that they'll be pretty happy that Arda Hegerberg is still not a Norwegian player internationally, at least anyway, because that would have caused them some real test on Wednesday night. But we wish them all the best, and do keep an eye on the Women's World Cup here in the UK on BBC, and the highlights can be found on YouTube on FIFA's channel. There's some great stuff happening over there. But let's switch gears to the men now, Adam. And France got a good win last Saturday, at least anyway. It's Bolivia that we didn't really touch upon because of our awards. But they followed that up with a pretty dire display against Turkey. I mean, there's a lot of knives out after this one, and it seemed like losing Conte and not having him in the side, it simply crumbled them, unfortunately. And in an essence, it was probably a little bit fair on France that they lost 2-0, because in another day this could have been 3, 4, or even 5 to the brilliant Turks.
Yeah, Turkey were really good. I think you're absolutely right. Excuse me, that Conte was a huge miss. Really, it really underlined how important he is to this team, and that, as we saw in the World Cup, this France side are a little bit functional, perhaps, but they get the job done. And there's a fine line between being functional and having that sort of winning mentality to dropping off in intensity and dropping off in dynamism and becoming a little bit turgid, which is really what happened against a really sort of aggressive and positive Turkey team in Konyaspor in Konya, and it just felt like that there was such a lack of impetus in this team without Kante, without the pace of Dembele as well, missing out. Lamar slightly injured on the bench. Perhaps he could have offered a little bit more creativity, and it's sort of dropped off into that sort of a little bit more slower build up and unable to break teams down a little bit, lacking creativity. And you're absolutely right. Burak Yilmaz had a number of chances that he really should have scored, and it could have been genuinely embarrassing for Deschamps' team. And it just underlines, one, the quality in this. Even though this looks like a pretty easy group for France, there's still games that are going to cause some issues, and that they can't just sleepwalk into the finals. Although that's probably what a lot of French fans would have think when they saw the draw, and that there's going to be difficult games, and that this team has, although they are World Cup winners, they still have things to think about and improve upon. And also, perhaps the headline is that there isn't really a replacement for Kante, not just in this French team, to be honest, as a caveat to that, but in world football, to be honest. But they need to find better ways to win without him, and need to replace what he does, even if not with a similar player, but with in another way, in a more imaginative, tactical sort of outlook from Deschamps. And it felt like just a little bit of lacking intensity, and they really sort of, I don't know. I just felt like there's a lot of walking and a lot of. It's been a long season, to be fair to them as well, but I still think there's a lot of lacking of energy from Le Bleu.
Yeah, that's the funny thing about it. It's a long season, but it's a long season for everyone.
For everyone, yeah.
It's the funny sort of double-edged sword on this moment, really, that players have. And the interesting one I thought at the end of this one, Jez, was that the knives were out for a lot of players, but especially Kylian Mbappe, who was really ineffectual throughout and wasn't particularly great against Bolivia either. Do you put that down to the fact that he has played so much football? Is the end of the season, or was this just a bit of a turgid performance from him and from the rest of the team as well?
I think there's an element of that, and I think that the sort of excuse, if you want, of it being a long season stands to a point, because to be fair, I haven't looked at the stats, but you'd assume that the French players with European competitions have played more matches than the Turkish players, and maybe certainly more intense matches. Obviously, people like Loris and Sissoko coming off the Champions League final only last week. So maybe there's an element of an excuse there. But, in Mbappe's case, he is still young. He has basically played the whole season, carrying PSG at times when his two main striking partners have been injured. So and obviously didn't have much of a break last summer. So I can understand a bit of a drop-off. But I think that the issue with him is, I'd say it's twofold. First of all, that I think that UNFP comment that he made about wanting more responsibility, although that was for PSG rather than France, I think that kind of created a rod for his own back, because I think everyone's viewing everything since then in that context. And if he has a poor match, it's going to be very easy to kind of use that as a stick to beat him with and say, oh, well, you're saying on one hand you're ready for more responsibility, and then you come up with performances like this. You're obviously not ready to take that responsibility, which maybe is unfair, but he's the one that kind of created this issue in the first place. And the other one is that after the match, Yannick Stoppuat, the former French striker, made a very good comment saying, well, when I was growing up as a footballer, my first coach said to me, if you're having one of those days where things aren't going right, keep it as simple as possible. Don't try to dribble and beat three men. Look for the simple pass, keep things moving, that kind of thing. And that's exactly the opposite of what Mbappe did. Every time he got the ball, he tried to beat the man himself. So many times there were better options available and he just completely ignored them. And then even on the defensive side, Giroud and Griezmann, as usual, were doing the press, and Mbappe just wasn't interested. And I think that's part of the issue. Again, maybe if Giroud or Griezmann were to have an off day like that, they've sort of got enough history of being real team players that people maybe overlook it just this once kind of thing. But with Mbappe, there is this growing feeling that he's becoming a little bit too selfish, wanting to kind of hog all the headlines for himself. And I think that's going to be a big problem and something that needs to be kind of that Deschamps needs to keep an eye on, because against Bolivia, he did it as well, got away with it a little bit more because of the rest of the team's functioning. But it was sort of a glaring issue against Turkey. He's trying to do it all himself. There was one point he had a great crossing opportunity. He waited for two people to come to him to try to beat them and then lost the ball straight away. And it's so frustrating. It must be frustrating for his teammates as well. We know how brilliant he is. We know that on a great day he can beat a team almost single-handedly. But that clearly wasn't one of those days. And I think sometimes he needs to learn to kind of wind his neck in at times. And he's learned all the lessons he's had to face in his career very well so far. So I hope that this is the next one that he learns. But I fear a little bit that he's getting slightly too big for his boots at the moment.
There was quite a good quote from Ludovica Braniak on RMC after the match, which I think pretty much nails that point that Jez just made. He said that Mbappe's ultimately still a kid. He will be a superstar. He's got everything, all the attributes to be a superstar. He'll get to that status. The problem is that he sometimes wants that to the detriment of others. And I think the key bit there to sort of tack on to the end of what Jez was saying was, when that happens, you see the irritation, you see the annoyance. And what we've now started to see is he's developed a certain selfishness to his play. So it is something that's starting to become slightly prevalent in Mbappe's play, both at club and international level. So it's going to be interesting to see how that gets managed. Deschamps won't have too much issue in terms of telling Mbappe that and managing that. It's a case of, can Deschamps get that kind of support for Mbappe at club level? Which, I think we can all agree there's probably question marks over to whether that will actually be the case.
Yeah, and that's the interesting bit, isn't it? And just the performance overall, it was turgid. Pogba was placing passes here, there, and everywhere, trying to do the Hollywood ball. Griezmann couldn't get into the game. None of the attackers really could. They really struggled, and they just got caught every single time that Turkey came forward. And like you say, Adam said, if Yilmaz had one of his better days, really, it's been a long season for him, the Turkish striker, then it could have been really, really bad for France. But the funny thing about this European qualification is, the reason we're recording before tonight is that they play Andorra tomorrow, and I know both my colleagues were mentioning the Luxembourg result to just remind me that not everything's a foregone conclusion in international football, but it's as close to one as you can find, at least anyway. And the fact that two go through pretty much automatically means that France can afford results like this now, because there is that bit of a cushion for the bigger teams that, yes, has helped for some of the smaller teams in this qualifying, but it certainly doesn't hurt the world champions at the moment. So we'll see how they get on heading into next season. Let's go on to our next topic tonight, and we're going back to Ligue 1 because there's plenty of shifting around and managerial changes and transfer rumours, but we're going to start with the former. And we talked about it a few times, Adam, on the show about who Saint-Etienne will replace Jean-Louis Gasset at the helm. And there was a large feeling that from the players, at least anyway, that they wanted Gisèle Priton as their coach, and that is how things have handled out for them. there is some, at least from our point of view, question marks about this, despite the players' determination for him and the respect he has, because the last job he had was with a club that was relegated. So there's a bit of an interesting point here where players were very much in his camp to get the job, but at the same time, he's questionable whether he's actually up for this Europa League challenge at Saint-Etienne or beyond next season. Yeah,
it's a really interesting one. I think that given the players' enthusiasm about Priton, that the board had not necessarily little choice. I mean, they're free to appoint the manager they feel is appropriate, but it's rare that such players will support a potential managerial candidate with such fervor. So I really like that they went with that. I think that's a good sign ahead for next season, because for a manager in this situation, the support of the players and having the players on side is 50% of the battle. And it's because I don't think that Saint-Etienne would have wanted Gasset to retire the way that he did. He's did an absolutely brilliant job with the club, considering where they were when he took over after that 5-0 defeat and the Julien to Lyon and the Julien Sablé sort of miniature reign that he had. He's done an unbelievable job. And Priton feels like a similar character and a similar personality, having been his assistant for that period. There'll be continuity, and you just feel that he would sort of fit the role and fit the sort of the take, fill his shoes sort of in an emotional sense, as well as a sense of continuity, that they'll continue doing similar things. And you'd hope that this will just sort of roll over into Priton's era, and they'll continue to perform and work in a similar way that they had under Gasset. And that's what the players, I imagine, that's what the players are thinking, given the support they've shown for him, and that's what the board are thinking as well. But as you said, Bastia got relegated, and that's really his only sort of senior managerial role, is in the hot seat, if you like, from being an assistant for various other teams and been at Montpellier for a while too. So there is a leap of faith being taken here, both by the management and by the players, that he is adept tactically enough to adapt to situations that will occur in the Europa League, to manage his squad over a course of a very long season, which French teams of late have struggled with, that Europa League Thursday, Sunday. Although, just as an aside, Thursday, Sunday is exactly the same as Wednesday, Saturday that you play in the Champions League, so that's a little bit of a fallacy to me. But even so, it is an intense campaign. So he's got questions, of course, but I feel like this is the right appointment for the club, and I support the players. It's great to see them come out and say, this is the guy we want. We really believe in him. So an interesting appointment, but one that has pitfalls.
Absolutely. And the interesting one on this one, Jez, is, like we say, a lot of players came out in the backing of him and admitting they wanted him to stay, and that even to some extent in the terms of Jan Villa saying he would leave if it wasn't Priton in charge. Now he is, and those players are staying. Was that one of the main factors in the point of appointing him in making sure that this squad stays together as well?
I think it probably is. I think, as Adam said, I think it's sort of one and the same thing, that continuity both on the bench and hopefully with the playing staff as well. I've said before, I think certainly in Villa's case, less so Cabella, because he seems like almost an adopted child of Priton going back years. But in Villa's case, considering his career wasn't particularly going anywhere and Saint-Etienne have kind of revived it a little bit, I think it's pretty pathetic to hold the club that's saved your career somewhat to ransom like that. But whatever the reasons, that definitely has to be a factor. He has been one of their more important players this season, and they are about to embark on a tough season, trying to build on what was it, fourth place, I think, and a European campaign in parallel. So it makes sense to keep your best players and to try to keep the consistency of last year and then build from it, rather than have to start again from scratch, certainly in such an important position as sort of holding midfielder. So I think definitely Priton being there means that hopefully players like Villa, like Cabella, maybe Kasri as well, are going to remain. And if they can, they all had sort of unplayable periods and pretty patchy periods over the season. But if they can find the level of consistency and the stronger periods that they had last season, if they can maintain that for longer periods next year, then there's no reason why Saint-Etienne can't at the very least match last year, and hopefully also have a great European run.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how he follows on and how that team follows on. On to the next appointment for yourself, Rich. We mentioned it briefly before the awards yesterday, last week, but we didn't really actually talk about it because Andre Villas-Boas was confirmed as Marseille manager just before we started, and there was a lot of focus on who actually won our awards last week. But an interesting appointment for Marseille, a man who's been more familiar with the Dakar Rally more recently than actual footballing terms. So despite his CV, where he had an excellent time in that year at Porto, has been a little bit up and down since then, to be perfectly honest, and a little one out of left field, given that he is certainly a name that a lot of European football will be aware of, but he's been in China as his most recent job, where he struggled at Shanghai Shenhua as well. It's an interesting appointment for them.
Yeah, I think there's certainly more safer options they probably could have gone for, and more, dare I say it, sensible options they could have gone for. But, I guess this is a big summer for Marseille. There's talk that they're needing to sell players. And, potentially there's going to be 3 or 4 of the sort of bigger name players possibly departing Marseille in the summer. So they need someone that can come in and maybe, if they're limited on what they can spend, maybe they're going to have to rely on, come and work under this name. And Villas-Boas, he's got a name. I've said it before. I've no idea if he's actually a decent coach or not. There's so much that sways you one way or the other, but I don't know where I lie on whether he's a good coach or not. I really haven't seen enough to determine, were his spells at the likes of Chelsea just one-offs and a bit of a blip, or was Porto a bit of a fluke? I've no idea. Marseille will be a tough place for him to go, and certainly there are easier places he could have gone to get back into the swing of coaching. But if he's given the license and Marseille are able to recruit, and finally they're able to recruit sensibly, then we've said it before. There's a bedrock there at Marseille. You've got a fantastic stadium. You've got the prestige of who Marseille are. You've got probably some of the most passionate supporters in all of France. There's a lot going for Marseille. They just need someone that can steer them in the right direction, and probably ultimately someone who knows what that right direction actually is. So, if Villas-Boas helps them, recruit some wise players and sensible players in the summer, then it's a good move. I think my concern is, one, obviously he's been out of the game for a while now, and 2, he's on an absolutely ridiculously extortionate salary. With Marseille's finances being relatively restrictive, is that salary eating into any of those expenses? If it is, then that's a pretty dumb move, I think, from Marseille. If it isn't, and they've paid him what he needs to be paid to get him through the door, and he can deliver what obviously they hope he can deliver, then obviously that's fine. But it's a gamble at a time where I'm unsure, not for definite, but I'm unsure whether Marseille need to take a gamble at this point in time. I think maybe it might have been sensible to get someone stable in. Garcia was certainly a love him or hate him, and certainly towards the end it was very much hate from the Marseille fans, but it wasn't all on him. He took the brunt, and ultimately he's the one that's lost his job, but those above him carry just as much responsibility. So it's almost pointless splurging all this money if those at the top still haven't learnt their lessons of what's gone wrong over the last 2 or 3 seasons. So unless they have, you fear that Villas-Boas is just going to be a waste of money. So you would hope with the likes of people that Villas-Boas has had to work under during his coaching career, you'd like to think he's come in on the proviso, he has more of a say. It was definitely a case that Zubizarreta and Rudy Garcia didn't see eye to eye. I think that certainly towards the end of Garcia's time at Marseille became very apparent. So I think it's a case of is Villas-Boas confident and that he can build a working relationship with Zubizarreta, or has Villas-Boas got the sign off from ultimately all the way up to McCourt that he will have a firm, definitive say in their summer business? You would only hope from a Marseille perspective that that's the case, because if it's still left to those senior bods above the coach, then you're going to have, as a Marseille fan, another season of frustration, of disappointment, and underachieving. So it's a real interesting gamble, and who knows? I really don't know what way this is going to go. I want Marseille to be back. I want Marseille to be a great club once again. As much as we joke about it, no one enjoys seeing such a huge name of French football as Marseille floundering, struggling, frustrated, angry fans in the stands. We don't want to see that. We want to see, Marseille developing that rivalry again with PSG at the top. So whether Villas-Boas is the man to get them closer to that target, we'll just have to wait and see.
Much like Rich says, Adam, it's a very interesting appointment. I mean, there was even quotes from AVB a while ago. I think it was even after the Europa League final with Porto, where he said he only wants to be in coaching for 10 years and then drop out to do other interests, which would be 2021, ironically. So, but if he might only have the 2 years at Marseille, but at the same time, it is a little bit difficult to judge just how good he is at a coach. I mean, he had that sensational year at Porto where he won the treble and was undefeated in the league, and went to Chelsea and it all went a bit wrong. He had that decent year at Spurs, but it went sour there as well. He won stuff at Zenit, but at a time where Zenit were really still the powerhouse of Russian football, and he struggled at Shanghai before his sort of sabbatical. Almost like I suppose more would see it as a gap year more than anything in the things that he did. But it's a little bit difficult to judge exactly how much of a success or a failure it would be. Where do you see him on the managerial scale? Is he sort of the blockbuster appointment they were looking for, or is this a name with a risk?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think it definitely fits the criteria of a minor blockbuster. He is a name. He's had success, relative success anyway, in the past, and obviously that year at Porto was fantastic. Although he had a brilliant team. Although I also think that it's a sort of a marriage of convenience in that Marseille think they need a big name coach. They think that the policy seems to be is that if they get a big name coach with a reputation, that the performances and the quality of the football will just simply follow regardless of the team that they have. And it feels like this is basically the same appointment as Rudy Garcia. It's very similar. Garcia was arguably more successful than Villas-Boas in his career, winning the league with Lille, of course, and did okay at Roma in spells. And so I guess that's probably actually relatively similar, but it just feels like a very, very similar appointment. But I also feel that Villas-Boas needs Marseille. It's interesting what you say about his career, that he'd only want to do 10 years in coaching, and he's approaching the end of that, which in itself sort of hints at a degree of lack of desire to succeed. If he is thinking along those lines still, what is he planning on achieving in the next 2 years with Marseille? I know they haven't won a trophy since 2012, so I suppose that would be a sizable achievement. But even so, what is he hoping to get out of this, other than the huge salary that you mentioned that he is on? But assuming that he does still have sort of a passionate coaching outlook, that this is perhaps the best he could have hoped for, given that the trajectory of his career overall. You're right, did okay at Zenit, but obviously they were still the best team in Russia at that period, and kind of went off the grid in China, which is what kind of happens to players and managers when they go out there. And I don't know that he could have got a better job in Europe or a bigger club. Maybe he could have gone to one of the Portuguese big three, but then I suppose that's again a little bit based on his reputation and his nationality. Of course, he's probably more well known there and more liked and more highly regarded there after what he did with Porto and Academia than in other countries. But in general European terms, I feel like this is the biggest club he could have got. So I think that they need each other. Villas-Boas needs, if he does want to revitalise his career, he needs a club like Marseille to sort of return them to sort of their former glories, I suppose. And Marseille are looking for a coach of his stature, relative stature, I suppose, to fit in with their policy of find the coach that we think is good and has a reputation and we believe in, maybe through slightly flimsy reasons, to drag this team, which we know isn't particularly laced with quality, and that the bigger players will leave and we haven't got much resources, drag them to the place where we think will be. And they're sort of putting all their sort of eggs in that Villas-Boas basket, if you like. So I think that it sort of falls down on both sides, and it's really interesting to see how it will play out. For me, I think it's actually I can only see it going one way, and that's almost exactly the same as Garcia's reign, in that I think he'll probably threaten to do okay, and they'll probably performance will probably pick up. They might even have a purple patch for half a season, 2/3 season, but ultimately, this time, 18 months, 2 years time, I'd be very surprised if he was still there.
That's the interesting thing about this one, Jez, and I just want to finish with this question that I know you'll like the sound of. This feels very Marseille, doesn't it?
Yes, to an extent. They're always kind of in search of a big name, and as Adam said, this is probably a bigger name as they're going to get at the moment. But yeah, I echo both Adam and Rich's concerns. He's more a name than a sort of role of honour at the moment, and that's the concern. And I think I often get the impression Marseille fans don't know what they want. Do they want the trophies? Do they want the great football that at least excites the Velodrome crowd? Obviously, ideally, they want both, but realistically, that hasn't happened for a long time now. The last time they won the title was under Deschamps, playing relatively dour football, and I think a lot of the fans sort of don't really know how they feel about that. I think Villas-Boas will probably get them playing good football. But yeah, as Adam said, probably in patches, and I don't think it will be enough for them to probably even make the podium, or certainly win trophies. And so then I think we'll get a better idea what Marseille are looking for. But it's hard to say. He's, as they both said, you can look at some elements of his career and say clearly there is a good coach there, and other elements and say is his heart really in the coaching? Like you said, he's kind of more associated with the Dakar Rally in recent years, and so it's a big risk. And maybe Marseille are at the stage where that's what they need. They just need to do something different, because by being Marseille and by going for this kind of looking for this messiah, like a big name like Michel, or a name like Garcia, who's done everything in France and did quite well abroad, it wasn't really working out for them, and maybe they do need to try something different. So in that sense, it's not very Marseille-like, but going for someone who's a relatively well-known name but doesn't necessarily have anything behind it, in the hope that that's going to just make everything okay, does smack of some of the mistakes they've made in the past. And the bottom line, as Rich said, is that if they can't bring in the right players, which is going to be difficult for them to do with the relative financial restraints that they've got, or we'll touch on a couple of transfers soon. If they can get some of the money that's being suggested for some players, then they'll be better off than I would have thought they would be. If they can't bring in these players, and certainly if they can't get all the decision makers sort of pushing in the same direction, and it doesn't really matter who's coach, because they're not going to have anything to work with.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating, I think, this season, and it does feel very boom or bust, and I think that's what makes it exciting for us of the neutral variety, but maybe not so much for the Mo's of the world, at least. Anyway, he might be a little bit worried. Let's go on to our transfer rumours then, because there's been plenty happening, some confirmed, some half confirmed, some still well within the air, but we'll go round and discuss them. And we're going to start, Rich, with the one that was kind of broken earlier today. No one has actually confirmed it, but Didier Deschamps has let loose that Ferland Mendy is pretty much on his way to Real Madrid. He said there earlier that from 2 years it's gone from Ligue 2 to now Real Madrid, and no one's confirmed that from either club yet, but that's the national manager may be letting some news that's going to happen next week or later this week at least anyway slip. It's a big move for him. He's a great player. We know how great he's been. It was in the GFFN team of the year and has had tremendous background. He's going to be a player that France are going to use a lot. And is he someone capable of being the replacement to Marcelo, who has been admittedly terrific for Real Madrid for a number of years?
I think so. I mean, I speak as someone who was never Marcelo's biggest fan, so maybe I'm not the most objective here. But you know, we all know what a terrific player Ferland Mendy is. He's made, as Deschamps himself said, such huge strides in such a short space of time. You know, he was obviously great for Le Havre. Lyon bought him. He was excellent last season. Maybe a little rash one or two times in terms of his defending. He's worked on that. I don't think that's as much of a problem this season. He's had another really solid season. You know, he's looked far more comfortable when it comes to defending. Adds a lot in terms of going forward. Very, very keen to move forward. You know, the way that Lyon play means that he's often having to do the job of pretty much two players at times down that left wing. So it's not surprising that a team like Real Madrid have come in for him. You know, Olas is never going to turn down an offer of, I mean, it's looking close to 50 million euros for him. There's not a chance in hell Olas will turn that down. You know, he joined from Le Havre for 5 million, and in the space of 2 seasons, they've turned him into a 50 million euro player. Yeah, it's fantastic business for Lyon, and they can obviously use that money to bring in a replacement, because they are going to need a replacement, because they really are, you know, there's not much there in terms of left back options. So, you know, who they bring in there will be interesting. But Real Madrid will be getting a fantastic left back. You know, he'll be there for, you know, 5-6 seasons comfortably. I think he'll make that transition from Marcelo very smoothly. It's clear that Zidane is a big fan of his. You know, he's made that progression into the French team in the last 12 months. He's not looked particularly phased at international level. So, you know, he's an excellent player. And as we've seen with other players, you know, fullbacks have suddenly become hugely in demand, and the money that you're getting for them is, you know, it's borderline ridiculous. So, as I say, it's a deal that Lyon are never going to turn down. It hopefully from a Ligue 1 fans' perspective means that they won't have to, you know, sell quite as many players. You know, we want to see Juninho being given and Silvinho being given as much opportunity as possible to make a success in their first season, and key to that, of course, is maintaining as many players as possible. Whether it also means the knock-on effect, I suppose, is what happens with Ndombele. You know, he's made some noises recently that, you know, his departure is not a foregone conclusion, that he'd be more than happy to stay. Ultimately, there's Champions League football with Lyon next season. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, well, does that mean that he will stay? You know, of course, if he stays, that's obviously a huge positive for Lyon. I don't think they necessarily anticipated getting 50 million coming in for another player other than Ndombele this summer. So the fact that they have, you know, you would hope from a Lyon perspective might mean that there's less of a rush, less of a need to cash in on Ndombele this summer.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that knocks onto the rest of the transfers that we're expecting, given that Olas was not going to give everyone away, at least anyway. But one potential incoming, Adam, that's hit the waves in the last couple of a week or so that's really got some stirring involves Marseille as well, because they're possibly looking to sell players where they can. And supposedly Luis Gustavo is one that's interesting Lyon. It's one of the stranger links so far, at least. Anyway, it's difficult to go across that dividing line, as Mathieu Valbuena would attest, even though he took a detour elsewhere before joining Lyon. But is it really a transfer you could see happening?
I would have said no originally. You're absolutely right. It is a line you don't really you sort of very reluctantly cross, and I suppose it's just because of the furore that it creates, and the relationship that Gustavo has with the Marseille fans, and they adopted him really pretty quickly as a bit of a sort of cult hero, and he had a brilliant season last season. This season hasn't been anywhere near as good. It hasn't struggled at centre back when they've played him there. I still think he's been pretty decent in midfield, but perhaps not quite the presence he was last year. And I don't know how that he sort of goes back on that relationship that he himself has admitted with the Marseille fans is something quite special. To go to Lyon, and the rivalry those two teams have, not just generally, but these two sets of players have over the last few years, with the scuffles in the tunnel at the end of last season, with that Marcelo holding up his shirt to the crowd, and the scuffle in the tunnel with Adel Rami and all that's involved. I don't know how that he goes from one side to the other, but I think now perhaps it makes a little bit more sense given the Brazilian influence at Lyon that's developed there over the last couple of months, with Juninho coming back as obviously a sporting director, as we discussed before, and Silvinho as manager. Those guys will have some sort of relationship, I would imagine, and I can see there being some sort of partnership between the three of them. Gustavo's, so I still think, got a lot to offer. Lyon would slot in nicely in that midfield in various positions, in various roles, and perhaps wouldn't expect to start, but be a really good presence off the field as well. So it makes sense from a sporting point of view, I suppose, from Lyon's point of view. But beyond that, I'm struggling, but I'm coming around to the idea, given the Brazilian contingent. I can see why they want him. I can see why it would be a partnership that work, but I still would be surprised if it went through.
Yeah, it does seem like a unlikely one. We're going to flick through a couple of these now, and Jez, I thought I'd give you one that's sort of been confirmed in terms of at least moving on, and that's the one I mentioned in the news about Gianluigi Buffon not staying on at Paris Saint-Germain. This makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. It was always going to be a little bit of a risk when he came in, and there was a kind of 1-year contract with the option to extend, which suggested that maybe no one was entirely sure how it was going to work out. I think I don't think it's possible for someone like Buffon not to benefit things behind the scenes. I mean, he's such a great keeper of great experience that he surely has helped the keepers out. Generally, such a great man in football that he must have done his bit to pass on his experience to a lot of the players there. But the bottom line is that in terms of goalkeeping performances, I don't think he was good enough. And as we seem to say so often, so much with PSG has to be judged just based on Champions League. And the bottom line is that he, more than anyone else, I guess, was at fault in that infamous Man United match. And I think just the time has come, not necessarily for him to retire, but I don't think he is that top level goalkeeper anymore. And what I'd like to say is that Areola absolutely is, and it's really time for PSG to back him and make him the undisputed number one. But there's so many rumours about Kevin Trapp coming in and maybe being a joint number one again, Keylor Navas coming in, that still seems to be a point of debate at PSG, which is mystifying to me. I mean, there are PSG fans who aren't convinced about Areola, but first of all, you ask them to point to any particular matches or particular mistakes, and they struggle to. And secondly, I think any goalkeeper who's undermined and not able to have a consistent full season run in goal is always going to struggle if they're not able to build that week in, week out relationship and trust with their defenders. So to me, it's mystifying that they're not sort of putting all their eggs in the Areola basket, if that makes sense. But yeah, as far as Buffon goes, it's been great to have him in French football for a year. As I said, I think he probably has benefited PSG a little bit behind the scenes, but just from a playing point of view, I don't think it was a successful season, and I think it's right that he should be moving on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the point sometimes, isn't it? That he's obviously a great man and has been a terrific goalkeeper, but it's maybe time for him, if reports are believed, maybe to even sit on the Barcelona bench. Let's just flick through a couple of these just before we move on a little bit. It's some really interesting ones going through. I'll start with you, Rich, on Morgan Sanson. He's been linked with a number of English clubs, believed to be about €35 million sort of offer they're looking at least anyway. Possibly a good move if he goes to the Premier League?
I think it's an excellent move for Marseille. 35 million for Sanson. It's a bit of a payday treat, I think, for Marseille. Morgan Sanson, I feel, has been a slightly frustrating player. I think we all know and can recognise on his day he's a really talented midfielder. He's just struggled. Now, maybe that's to do with his surroundings. He was such an excellent player at Montpellier, has moved to Marseille, and for a number of potential reasons, the move hasn't perhaps necessarily developed him where he should have got to. He's a quality player. Maybe a move to the Premier League, to the right Premier League team, and surrounding him with really good players, and that Wolves team really does feel like a midfield that he could prosper in. I think the only fear is, is he going to be up for the physicality of the Premier League? That's something that maybe has to come with a little bit of time and experience playing in that league. But I could certainly see Marseille. I mean, by all accounts, Marseille are actively trying to sell him and move him on to certainly Premier League teams who can afford that kind of money. So it wouldn't surprise me to see him go, but I think he needs to, for his own good and for his own development, needs to make sure that that's a move to the right Premier League team.
Yeah, that's going to be the interesting bit on that one. Adam, in terms of actually an incoming for Marseille, they've been linked with Roma striker Patrick Schick, who's had a pretty good couple of days, at least anyway, in terms of internationally, if not great at Roma this season. That breakout campaign at Sampdoria, but hasn't done an enormous amount much. Is that kind of right risk in terms of striker for them? A player that's young, that has scored goals previously at a decent rate, and someone that they maybe can sell on if it doesn't quite work out to the level they want?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. It depends on the fee, I think, because he's obviously a talented player. Was really good at Sampdoria in that season. Was expected to kick on at Roma, as you mentioned, and hasn't. And he's had a really up and down time. Even this season, he's been really up and down. Didn't start any of the last 6 games of the season. Only got off the bench twice, and was in and out of the team throughout the course of the season. And Dzeko being injured a little bit, and Under was injured for a while as well. Perotti has suffered injuries for a lot of the season. So he's kind of been filling in, and he definitely isn't. I don't think his future is at Roma. I don't see him, assuming that, Dzeko's 33 now. I don't see him slotting into that role as a central striker anytime soon. And I don't think he's necessarily proven to the club that he has the quality to do so in the near future. And a move to somewhere like Marseille is obviously a slight set down for Roma. He needs game time. He needs service. He needs to be in a position where he can reestablish himself at 23 years old. He's at a period in his career where he doesn't want to be sitting on a bench, albeit like at a good team. He wants to be starting and wants to be proving himself, and he's got the quality to do that based on that year at that spell at Sampdoria, where he really was fantastic and really good finisher, and potentially a really good goal scorer. If he sort of slots in the void left by Balotelli, I think that would be a good move for Marseille. And given the quality that he potentially has, it would be a worthwhile move, assuming they can get him for a relatively, assuming it's a permanent transfer, for a relatively, I don't want to say cheap, but for a manageable fee. That would be a good move for all concerned, I think.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that one develops. Just go back to PSG briefly, and I'm going to stick with just the interesting outs, I suppose, in terms of Rabiot situation has sort of fluxed in the last couple of weeks because of the rumours of Leonardo coming back and Antero Henrique supposedly leaving in, if that was to come to pass. And potentially Rabiot might even stay. He's been linked with Manchester United. He's been linked with Everton surprisingly, given that the previous ones of Barcelona and turning down Tottenham as being too much of a step down. But it feels like this one might drag and drag.
It could do, and it shouldn't do. And Rabiot is kind of destroying his own career at the moment, it feels. And if some of the rumours about him backtracking and sort of reopening the door to PSG are true, I actually don't think it's the worst idea in the world for either side. But I think those bridges are probably well and truly burnt now, and a little bit like what I said about Areola, I feel like there's a bit of revisionism from PSG fans who, as far as I'm concerned, Rabiot very rarely let PSG down. I think he was very consistent for them, particularly in the Champions League when lots of other players were completely missing. And as Tuchel clearly acknowledged, they really could have done with him at times this season. But clearly the relationship now is so poisonous, and that even Leonardo, with all his skills, I doubt would be able to resurrect that unless Rabiot sort of grabbed a hat trick in his first match next season for PSG. I just can't see the fans sort of accepting it anymore. So the question is where he moves on to, and again, it can't be in dispute, even though PSG fans suggested that he wasn't always great for them. But potentially Rabiot is a fantastic midfielder. He's just or whether it's his fault or his mum's fault, whatever. They've scored a big own goal by kind of making it more about non-football matters. But if he can find the right move and be happy and play to his best, then whoever brings him in has got a fantastic midfielder. But the problem is that the attitude is making other teams think, or the attitude and the salary demands are making other teams think again. And he said that Spurs weren't big enough for him. It might not be popular, but I agree personally that Spurs aren't a big club. But the fact is they're Champions League finalists who are qualifying most years now for the Champions League. So in that sense, I don't know what else he wants. United are a bigger name, but aren't in the Champions League at the moment. Everton would be lovely, but I think it seems very unlikely. Barcelona, that fire sort of very quickly burnt out. So he's running out of options, and he's basically wasted a year of his career already. And unless something changes drastically soon, he may well find himself without a club coming into August, which would be a massive pity, because we're all sort of, as neutrals, we're all being robbed of seeing a very good footballer. As France fans, possibly another midfielder come in. As we said earlier, we have midfielders, but he's one of those players. I know he doesn't like that position, but who could play the slightly more defensive Kante role. And he's not pushing on. He's not making himself one of those contenders. Again, he shot himself in the foot in terms of the whole World Cup squad thing. But while he's not playing, he's certainly not close to the squad. And it's just a pity that due to probably bad advice, and maybe he has to take some of the blame himself as well, he's destroying what could and should be a really good career.
Yeah, it's sort of a fascinating story that's going to go on, and there's going to be plenty of transfer news to keep your ears to the ground on at GFFN this summer. Do make sure you're following us on Twitter, because there's going to be plenty to go on. That's almost all we've got time for, but our editor-in-chief, Christian Nuri, is joining us this evening with, I suppose, a little bit of an announcement you wanted to do, Christian. I'll let you take the floor more than anything, rather than giving much more of an intro.
Well, guys, hi. Thank you for having me, Nathan. As some of you know, tonight marks Nathan's final show as host of Get French Football News podcasts. And I wanted to jump on behalf of all of us to thank him for such incredible dedication and for spreading his love for French football with all of you at home. We will announce his replacement with a heavy heart shortly, but I would be remiss not to say a few words about the magnitude of his contribution. Because in 6 years, Nathan's dulcet tones have been heard around the globe by over 500,000 people. And it's that mixture of wit from the introductions and conclusions that he brings, the insight and that desire to bring you the narratives that drive French football, that have made him such a pleasure to listen to for over half a decade, especially in a football climate where French football is at the moment at times ridiculed for its one-club dominance, for the sort of derisory Farmers League narrative and more. Nathan, I've always found you to have cut through the noise and bring those weekly ongoings of French football, and that's educated and changed the minds of many about the league. So whilst the mission at Get French Football News will always be restricted in a bit of a way by the niche reality of its subject matter, it could not exist as it does today without contributions of the size and magnitude of Nathan. And so don't worry, guys at home, Nathan will still be with us next season, coming on as a guest from time to time. And I'm sure we all look forward to that. But Nathan, in the meantime, best of luck with everything else. And thanks again. And obviously, I, of course, leave it for you to close it all out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been terrific these last 5 years, and the last 300 odd programs that we've done, from the main show to the midweek previews to the Mercato shows that we've done several years, as well as the World Cup show as well. It's been a really great time. I've thoroughly enjoyed hosting. I've thoroughly enjoyed bringing myself to you at home that have been listening, to everyone that has been on the show, to everyone that's been pretty much a mainstay over the past few years. I'm thinking of Eric and Philip at the start, the preview show when we started with Adam, and we've had Sam on there and Tom as regular guests, as well as Peter and Rob and Rich and Jez themselves as well. It's been really, really terrific. I've really enjoyed my time, and it's on to pastures new in terms of at least not being able to host anymore, but at least I won't be completely gone. I'll be able to come on from time to time, and I'm thoroughly looking forward to that, and still sharing my thoughts and doing everything else. But that's all that we have time for this week. Again, my thanks to Rich, Jez, Adam, and all of you listening at home. Obviously, like I mentioned, I will be coming on from time to time, so do not fear, this might not be the last time you hear my voice. So it's not an au revoir, really. It's more of a see you soon. And on that note, a bientôt and goodbye.